I prefer to get underneath the car first and undo everything, is to not be laying in this kind of shit afterward. Alright, this is the part where we undo the exhaust pipe from the engine header. There's 2 bolts on either side of the engine, one header for each head. Once you drop the pipe down, that'll give you enough clearance with your tool to grab the engine mount studs, which are directly above the exhaust pipe on the Crossmember. By dropping the pipe down, that gives you enough room to get your socket in there and zip out the 2 14mm nuts. How do those threads look on there?
Pretty good.
Are the studs coming out or are the studs staying in?
No, they're staying in.
That is good. A lot of times when you pull these out, the studs will want to come out with the nut. And a lot of times with that, the studs will rip out the aluminum threads on their way out. And then when you go to torque it up, you get what you think is almost the right amount of torque, and then it lets go. Lucky for us, we do have a helicoil set if we have to get down into that. But this car is pretty clean and low miles enough that I don't think we're going to have any of those issues. Those are generally on cars that have been around long enough to be corroded and or partially overheated. There's a bolt that holds the tail half of the Y pipe onto a mount from the back of the transmission, which obviously has to come undone. And this will allow us to drop the pipe down further and swing it out of the way to get the exhaust transmission out. Now that we have our exhaust pipe dropped and out of the way, we will be able to place our jack on the front diff portion of the transmission to raise the whole engine up out of its motor mount studs and give us the clearance we need to pull the engine forward away from the bell housing. Alright, we now have the exhaust pipe dropped from the header. We have the bolt that holds it to the transmission mount undone, and we have the engine mount studs undone also. So now we go back to the top, we're ready to unbolt our bell housing. Before we start on our bell housing, before we lift our engine up past the Crossmember, we're going to pull the timing plug to expose the pressure plate, or excuse me, flex plate. And there are 4 12mm bolts that we will loosen and undo. It's very important if you're putting an automatic transmission together to not drop these bolts inside, because then you're going to have to take your whole motor out to get to them, which is not fun. I've been there and done that myself, so I know better. But there are 4 of these bolts. Once you undo those, as you start separating the engine from the bell housing, you're going to want to make sure the torque converter stays with the transmission, because sometimes it'll stick to the pilot hole on the back of the crank and will pull out with the engine, and if you do that, you're going to dump about 4 quarts of ATF all over the floor. And we can use a 7/8 wrench to rotate the crank to expose all 4 of our bolts. Once we have all 4 of our bolts out, then we can go on to doing the bell housing here and down at the bottom here. Although these bottom ones are easier to get to once you raise the engine up off its Crossmember, so we'll get to doing that first before we do these. We have the torque converter undone. We are going to go ahead with taking the starter out. If we're just pulling the engine, taking the starter out is not necessary, but it is necessary for pulling the transmission because it'll run into the firewall, and also having the starter out of the way will give you more clearance over here to reach the bottom bell housing bolts and have a little bit more room to get your hands down in there. Now the starter is connected to the main battery cables here. You have your power lead that runs to the side of the starter here, and then you have the negative lead which grounds to this bracket. It's not necessary to undo those from the starter, since all we need to do is undo this bolt here, and there's a 17mm bolt down here just below the starter, and the wires will stay connected to the starter. We can just pull it out of the way and just let it hang, and then if we do want to pull it out entirely, we'd have to undo this positive lead from the fuse panel, but other than that, this whole thing is contained entirely to the starter itself. There's a 14mm nut and bolt on the top, which is also part of the bell housing. We can undo the top ones, and then when we jack up the engine, we can get to the bottom ones a lot easier. Alright, now we have our bolt from the top of the starter. If we're only pulling the engine, the starter will have to come out, and this bolt is going to run into, usually it runs into where the positive wire bumps into it. and you can't pull it out all the way. Well, I managed to get it out anyway, but it only needs to come back far enough to clear the engine half of the bell housing here. And of course this bracket serves as the washer which goes on there. So once we undo the bottom nut, the starter's ready to come out. While I'm at it, I'm going to undo the axles from the transmission since we are removing our transmission. It takes a 3/16 punch or 60 millimeters. If you notice on the axle there's going to be a hole there. Usually one side is dimpled, and that's the side you're going to drive your pin from. So actually I should be driving my pin from this direction, but it's already halfway started out. So when we go to reinstall the axle, we will reinstall from the dimpled side. It kind of helps to guide the pin in there without it getting cricked up. On the passenger side of the car, it's easiest to get from up top. Driver's side of the car is easiest to get from the bottom. Now if this was a turbo, you'd want to grab it from the bottom as well, because otherwise, you know, this whole nice big empty space is occupied by a turbo. And two hands is better than one with this operation. We have it, there's our starter. Comes out in one piece. And of course the cables are still attached to it. And unless you want to take the starter completely out the car, just undo the main wire that comes off the fuse link. Otherwise you can just let her sit in the battery tray or on the strut, and it can hang out there until this thing goes back together. Alright, I've gone ahead and removed the Y pipe section of the exhaust. A lot of times with these you're going to have to cut the bolts just because they're so rusty. Theoretically you can just unbolt it, but a lot of times when you have that apart, you're going to want to have new bolts anyway when you go back together. The idea of jacking up the transmission is to free up the engine mount from the cross member. And as you can see as I go up, that's going to clear the cross member enough for the motor to slide forward. And you really get quite a room here. You can go up several inches with this engine. Also, if you're doing repairs like valve cover gaskets, it's easier to raise the engine up to where you can get to them easier. And you can even do so without removing the exhaust pipe, so long as you can get a tool in there above the pipe to undo the engine crossmember nuts. Have the engine raised up off the crossmember. There's a little bit more room to get to torquing these nuts. And if you, theoretically, if we were just pulling this engine and putting it back in, you could leave the transmission on the jack, and then you have all the room you need to go back together. And putting it back together is always good to have the room as well.